Here we go. We're going to get into our final deep dive on the final competency from the ICF, facilitating client growth, often associated with wrapping up the coaching session, action planning, commitment to next steps, accountability. But the old competencies, there were 3 of them out of the 11 old ones, that had to do with facilitating client growth. While those were very much focused on the end of a session, the ICF made the decision to take a bit of a different perspective on Competency 8. As they brought those other competencies together, they wanted to make sure the theme was clear, that it's not about just taking action, but rather helping the client grow. Because if the client solves their problem, but doesn't see growth through the coaching process around that situation or problem, then it's a real missed opportunity for the coach and the client. And so that leads us to the competency of facilitating client growth. Let's dive into the definition and elements here, and then we'll get into the comparison as we go. Let me move my camera a little bit. Definition: the coach partners with the client to transform learning and insight into action. Promotes client autonomy in the coaching process. We work, and first element here, the coach works with the clients to integrate new awareness, insight, or learning into their worldview and behavior. So even here, keep in mind, right off the bat, it's not just about the action, but instead it's about taking the new awareness that comes from those aha moments of the session and bringing that new awareness into a bit of a change of worldview or behaviors, not just a single solution, but a transformation. That's the intent of facilitating client growth. Number 2, partners with the client to design goals and actions and accountability measures that integrate and expand new learning. Not just doing action planning around the problem, but expanding one's ability to solve that similar problem in the future through the new learning that came from the session. Number 3, acknowledges and supports client autonomy in the design of goals, actions, and methods of accountability. So the most simple thing to say here is that the coach isn't the primary accountability partner. Instead, the coach is stimulating the discussion towards how the client might create new accountability methods for themselves going forward. Number 4, supports the client in identifying potential results of or learning from identified action steps. Again, it's about growth. So as we're doing action planning, we might also throw in there questions about what the person's learning about this type of situation, how they want to remember this this approach that they've taken with this type of problem for future problems, and those types of questions package up the benefit from the coaching session and make it more repeatable in future challenges. Invites the client to consider how to move forward, including resources, support, and potential barriers that will need to be overcome. There's the start to SMART model that's a part of my program, and I use the SMART acronym for SMART goals, and tie that with a bit of an acronym around GOAL, goal. And that shows the different kinds of questions between making things more specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-bound, but also how we might continue to generate ideas, overcome obstacles, and so on. Helping the client think broadly about the action, not just when will they do it, but how it might impact other things and what other things might impact their intent to take action. I often say to my coaches, be very careful about the just do it attitude in coaching. So if the client's like, oh, I'm just going to do it, especially when you're early on working with the client, you might offer just a prod or a poke around their plan, especially with questions around potential barriers or what might get in the way of this plan that you've come up with. Partners with the client to summarize learning and insights within or between sessions. So again, just make sure that it's about learning and not just resolution. Celebrates the client's progress and success, and partners with the client to close the session. So celebrating is an element we'll see as another theme. You have action planning, you have learning and development, and then you have celebration. Commemoration is another way to say this. And a lot of my coaches that I train prefer the idea of commemoration over celebration. How will this person celebrate and remember this moment? The celebration within coaching can sometimes just be the end of the session and just a nice little acknowledgement from the coach that says, hey, I just want to call out, really appreciate you putting so much effort in to coming up with a solution. I really couldn't have come up with this on my own. And I feel like you're really demonstrating a great deal of creativity through our session. So thanks for allowing me to coach you through this. That would be a type of celebration that would really, no, if heartfelt and fitting, would be meaningful. But sometimes a celebration is associated with the long-term agreement, a wrapping up of the coaching. And when it's that kind of celebration, the coach is helping the client think about what they're taking away from the entire engagement, the progress that they've made across multiple sessions, maybe months or a year or two of coaching, and how they're going to commemorate those successes in the long term. And then whether it's the close of a session or also the close of the entire engagement, the coach partners with the client in that close. Key skills evaluated: the coach's ability to support the client in exploring their learning about themselves. Note the order of this. First about themselves and their situation and the application of that learning towards the client's goals. It's not that the coach is forcing introspection all the time, but it is a good thing to insist on at least one question. I usually tell my coaches, even the more resistant client, it can be valuable to offer at least one question about what they're learning about themselves. The more we bring in the client language and relate it to their goal, the more safe that exploration can be. And hopefully the more and more over time, they become comfortable with the idea of learning about themselves and how that learning can help them create better solutions for themselves around their problems. Number 2, the coach's ability to partner fully with the client in designing actions from their new awareness, which may include thinking, feeling, or learning that support the client in moving toward their stated agenda or goals. So we need action planning at the end, but the action planning should use the language of the new awareness of the session and the language of the agenda. So as we're listening to the client and asking those powerful questions that evoke awareness from the beginning to 2/3 of the way through, 3/4 of the way through, we come to a time where we're often looking at next steps. Sometimes I see coaches drop meaningful language at that point, and they're just asking, when are you going to do that? How will you make sure that you get the job done well, or whatever? And suddenly they're out of the space of partnering around the meaningful client language. And that's the best time to pull on the threads from the very beginning. It's nice, wonderful callbacks on the meaningful start to the session and helping the client think about where they are now. And it helps the client get this appreciation for the entire journey as we bring in the meaningful language across the entire session, all the way to the close. And number 5, the coach's depth of partnership in closing the session. That partnership is demonstrated by asking open questions to help the client determine how they'd like to close the session. What else would you like us to explore before we wrap up today? Where should we go with the 5 minutes extra that we have today, whatever it might be? But also using client language helps that depth of partnership as well. Let's get to the comparisons. The coach supports the client in exploring how to apply the learning and awareness to post-session steps, actions, plans that are related to the client's stated agenda and have the potential to move the client forward in their thinking, learning, and growth. At this level, at the ACC level, the coach may also suggest resources to assist the client in achieving their goals, so long as the resources are not forced on the client. Now, like I've been saying, one of the main reasons I think there's value in doing this comparison is to imagine that the ACC minimum standards and the MCC minimum standards create a range, as well as the PCC in between. That I'm as an MCC coach, while I would generally not see this as my default to offer resources to assist in the client achieving their goals. If I'm working with someone newer to coaching, and they are wanting a little bit more from me, I'm very comfortable moving over to the more transactional range, but I'm not going to stay there. And I'm going to offer resources, but also ask about learning and growth. So I'm going to mix my approach while still giving them a little bit more guidance as they onboard into the coaching experience. An adaptive ability to guide and direct a client so that over time they're able to direct themselves more and more is really important to help a client understand, especially in a sponsored engagement where someone else is paying for it, to help the client understand the real value of the coaching over time while not losing out on the safety of the engagement. Specific evaluation criteria, the coach asks questions to support the client in translating awareness into action. Like kind of what we were saying before, the coach partners with the client to create or confirm specific action plans. Sometimes those action plans might be very concrete, transactional, not as much transformation might be explored. And the coach supports the client to close a session. And so even at the ACC level, if the coach says, okay, well, it sounds like we're done, I'll see you next week, that can be an evidence against the coach's ability to coach at the ACC level. So these need to be in place even at the basic level. Even if it doesn't have the best meaningful client language, it needs to have some action planning, partnering with that planning, and partnering a bit to close. Disqualifiers at the ACC level would be the coach insists specific prescribed action steps. These are your solution. This is the solution to your problem. If you just do these 5 easy steps, you will get what you want. Coaches, if they have that kind of approach, cannot be at the ACC level. If you do have a suggestion, it's not that you can't, because we see that the coach suggests action steps to the client. We see that here. And the problem is not that the coach offers this, but they're not really offering it in a way that creates partnership. So here it says the coach suggests actions or steps to the client that do not have a clear relationship to the client's stated agenda. But if the coach says, I've got an idea of what you might do, here it is. How might that relate to what you are hoping to achieve? What do you think of that idea? How might you adapt that idea to your plan this next week? So a coach can offer some ideas. Usually it's not the best thing to start with that. It's almost always best to say, hey, client, what's your commitment to this next week? What action will you take? What's your next step? Have them start. If they get stuck, maybe offer a suggestion and openly hand it back so that it is not a prescribed, this is the path. What I want you to do this next week is ABC. Instead, here's some ideas or an idea. What are your thoughts? So we can make those kind of suggestions, but we want to be very careful about it and also keep them pretty rare and make sure the client can adapt them for themselves. Okay, coach does not invite the client to identify or explore how the client's learning can be applied to future actions or activities that support the client's agenda. If the coach is driving it between actions and like if you take the learning and you see what they've learned and therefore you create their plan, then you've done coaching for 2/3 of the session, but now you're in mentoring or advisory mode. And in a way, that can be a very good way for a leader to integrate some coaching into a managerial conversation. But in a pure coaching conversation, we want to carry the coaching presence all the way through the conversation. And then the coach doesn't support the client to close the session. Now, this would be evidence against if the coach maybe closes it quickly. It's not necessarily a disqualifier. But if in conjunction with other signals of the coach is in charge, the coach just kind of shuts the conversation down, then yeah, that could easily get a disqualification. PCC markers. Here we go. Coach invites or allows the client to explore progress toward what the client wanted to accomplish in this session. This is the progress check style question, and this is especially helpful when the coach or when the client is getting to some sort of pause in their exploration. And the coach asks, just do a bit of a check-in. Where do you feel we are with the language of the agenda? Where do you feel we are? What have you learned about this topic from the beginning, and so on? So some sort of learning or progress check is very important for facilitating client growth at the PCC level. Coach invites the client to state or explore the client's learning in the session about themselves, the who. So Similar to what we saw with evoking awareness, the coach needs to make sure to coach around the person and the problem. And that's just the order that the ICF has here. Explore the who and explore the what, the situation, the agenda. And we want to help the client think about the learning that came up through the kind of evoking awareness through powerful questioning and reflections, and help the client consider what are they going to do with this learning? How will they use the new learning from the coaching session? So in a way, those three in particular are just kind of keep doing that all the way to the end of the session, and make sure the end of the session is focused on learning in action instead of just solving a problem. That's the main thing there. At the PCC level, performance standards, the coach partners with the client to design post-session thinking, reflection, or action. So this needs to be in light of 8.2, 3, and 4, where it's all based on or born out of the new awareness and the learning that came from the session. 8 points. Oh, and by the way, note the order here: design post-session thinking, reflection, or action. Sometimes a coach pushes back in the feedback I provide. They push back against the feedback because they feel like, well, sometimes the client, there's not going to be an action that they're going to take. So for me to say, so what action are you going to take this next week, wouldn't really feel right. And I would say, yeah, that's exactly it, because that's not responsive. You need to make sure exploring next steps is very responsive. And so sometimes you might prompt them to consider, how will you continue to think about this big decision about retirement between now and our next session? Or how do you want to keep track of your daily thoughts and emotions when it comes to these daily meetings with your manager? How do you want to continue to reflect on these questions that have come up in our session? How do you want to continue to reflect on this topic for yourself, since we're running out of time? And sometimes, most of the time, we'll have action steps that will have more of a concrete outcome, that can be timed. There's going to be more clear accountability and so on. But at the very least, every session should be able to have some sort of next step, even if it's thinking, reflecting, and sometimes action. Okay. Coach partners with the client to consider how to move forward, including resources, support, and potential barriers. We saw that in the general guidance. The coach partners with the client to design the best methods of accountability for themselves. And again, the coach is not the primary method of accountability. Sometimes a coach might offer to be the primary in the first couple of sessions, and usually you want to move away from that as quickly as you can. Most of the time, it's good to stay in that middle space of prompting the client and allowing the client to know that you'll also check in with them in the next session. It's less of an issue at the MCC level. If you ever see a client who is failing to follow through and they aren't meeting their goals, then you might suggest a bit more of a directive approach to accountability, where they rely on you to do a check-in and other resources. So that might move you down from a PCC performance standard for a recording if the client needs a bit more of a directive approach to accountability. Note, even if they need that, it should only be temporary that the coach offers it, generally speaking. The coach celebrates the client's progress and learning. We talked about that. Acknowledgments and celebration should be a part of the coaching process. And at the PCC level, this should be done with the client's meaningful language and what we've learned a bit about what the clients shared through the session or the sessions. And the coach partners with the client on how they want to complete the session. So we've seen that a few different ways. Again, the more you go from ACC to MCC, the more important the client's meaningful language is. So listens actively, and trust and safety, and maintaining presence. All of those kind of come in to elevate all these standards between ACC, PCC, and MCC. MCC overview: the coach fully partners with the client to explore the client's learning about their situation and themselves, and ways to apply that new learning to support the client's agenda, desired goals, and future growth. The coach partners with the client throughout the session to explore the client's progress in learning, and supports the client in reflecting on what the client is discovering about themselves. And so much of the coaching session that's at the MCC level is focused on that learning of the self. And usually through the learning itself, you have this big aha moment. And when the aha moment comes, the coach helps reflect on that aha moment and how that relates to potential next steps. The MCC coach demonstrates trust in the client to develop actions and accountability structures that are reflective of the client's agenda and broader learning or accomplishment that the client wants to obtain. Integrate the client's strengths as well as the best of the client's learning and creating methodologies. So in summary here, an MCC coach will coach around the who and trust the client with the what. The coach will not ignore action planning completely, but will prompt the client to do a lot more of the action planning on themselves and poke a little bit with some action planning questions. And oftentimes I would advise coaches that are pursuing MCC to check in on what the client would like to explore with planning before offering 3, 4, 5, 6 questions on action planning. Usually it's best to say, okay, so what do you want to do with that learning, using the client language to explore it? The next kind of question might be, okay, so how will you make sure that gets done? And that should be filled with client language. What could get in the way of that? Again, pulling in the client language. And so at that point, if I keep asking questions, now I'm in charge of the action planning. I want to be careful about that. So around the second, third, fourth question, I need to say, what else do you feel needs to be a part of your plan to give you the best chance of success with whatever it is. So even in the action planning, there should be partnerships so that the client, like the coach is demonstrating that the coach really does trust the client to develop the actions and accountability structures. MCC behavioral statements criteria. The coach checks in with the client and their progress, learnings, and insights in natural and spontaneous ways throughout the session. This is where the idea of a check-in is very important to do, but it's also just as important to make it feel like it's a natural part of the exploration. Another spot where the coaching at the MCC level or the expectations at the MCC level are good to honor at all levels, whether you ever get a credential or not, or if you're just practicing coaching, doing check-ins as you go is very important. If you don't check in, like every question we ask after the agenda is based a little bit on an assumption, what we think the client might need next, what language is most worthwhile to explore, and what kind of question to ask. And so they respond to that. We come up with the next question, which is another set of assumptions. Next question, next question, next question. Eventually, we have this big stack of assumptions. And if we don't check in, we're going to be holding this big weight on our shoulders of where the value of the session is going to be found. So we need to check in with the client. But if we just say, are we doing what you wanted to do with our conversation today? Then the client's going to feel like that sounds kind of weird and almost like the coach is asking for validation. And we don't want to do that. We want to say things like, as you consider the seed that is planted here and kind of the farm, the picture of the farm that you had at the beginning of our conversation, what are you learning between these two spots in our conversation? Or what's coming up for you at this big picture where you've stepped onto this mountaintop, you've kind of surveyed things. What's your perspective on the original agenda language? We can say at the beginning of the session, you wanted blank, pointing to the client language. Where in that journey are we right now? Something like that. So the main thing is be responsive, use the client language, make it come to life that way. If it ever feels like your check-ins aren't natural and spontaneous, it's because it's missing client language and it's not being responsive in the type of check-in it is. That's a good one to get mentor coaching feedback on, because the more like concrete examples you have across an entire session, the more you can point to different options of the check-in language. Get a bit of a sense for it. Coaches invite the client to sense and reflect on what they are learning about themselves. So learning checks, and then coach cultivates an environment for the client to intentionally apply their own learning. Generally, these are just expressions of the other behavioral statements or markers from ACC and PCC standards. The main thing here is even at the end of the session, all of these elements need to be done with high level of partnership, high level of responsiveness, and the strongest pieces of client language so that we are at that more transformative approach. And the disqualifiers. Here we go. Last one. This has been a good set of videos. I hope it's been helpful. MCC disqualifiers for facilitating client growth. The coach does not invite the full client participation or does not encourage client leadership in planning strategies, actions, and methods of accountability. If you start leading at the end of the session, then it just ends the assessment essentially. Like, they'll still give you feedback, but it's a big disqualifier if you take over the ship after you've navigated so well. Suddenly you take it over at the end. It would be a big disqualifier. Or if the coach dominates in any way the actions or applications of learning that are created. And sometimes it might not be the intention of the coach, but sometimes the habitual language they might use can get in the way. So if a coach might say, what I want you to do is consider what are some obstacles that could get in the way of the plan in using the client language. Even that little sense of what I want you to do could be this little check against, evidence against. Be very careful with automatic filler language that might betray a sense of, or might be interpreted as a sense of dominating or controlling. Be very careful about the imperative at the MCC level as well, like the tell me, can you tell me, and that kind of thing. Just because an assessor might interpret it a certain way, especially with the end of a session. The coach does not invite or partner with the client to explore what the client is learning about themselves and possible application of that learning, or if the application of learning do not reflect clear potential for forward movement by the client related to the client's agenda, desired outcome, or to some of other learning that the client has defined as necessary for their growth. So if you just ask about what they're learning about themselves, but you don't really relate that to their language and to their agenda, it's just going through the motions, it really wouldn't be evidence for MCC. And it could even get in the way of earning an MCC if the assessor sees that you are doing things technically, because the MCC approach is to do the technical things artfully. So be mindful all the way to the end, bring in the meaningful language and make things relevant, responsive to the client's needs, agendas, and what you know about them. And finally, design plans and goals and or discussion, designed actions involved only physical activity with no attention to the thinking, learning, being, and creativity structures of the client. So if the coach is doing the designing or any co-design, especially like mostly coach designed actions are only at the surface level and the coach isn't helping the client dig under the surface with their own plans, then that lack of growth contradicts the competency, especially at the MCC level. I like to say it a few times to my coaches, the coach's agenda, we have an agenda. It is to follow the client's agenda and to make sure it's about their growth. So at the MCC level, but this is useful across all of them, it is helpful for the coach to explore next steps, not only in what the client will do, but what they want to remember from the experience of solving this problem, making the decision, setting this goal for themselves, preparing for the conversation. How might they package the learning and carry it forward with them beyond? If this isn't done at the MCC level, it's a big miss, but it's also a missed opportunity at any level, because facilitating client growth is what we want to do with all that awareness we've evoked throughout the process. Thank you, everybody, for watching these videos. As always, I really hope this is helpful. I know this series, when I did it a while ago with the old competencies, and I try to have that old set on the side as well. I know they're long, and yet taking time to unpack how these competencies, the markers, the behavioral statements, the measures of success for each of these competencies, how they relate to real life coaching is very important. And also that sense of how might I adjust, even as an MCC coach, adjust towards ACC, even as an ACC oriented coach or a coach just starting out, how might you take on some of the transformative approaches? I want you to consider that range as something that you get to choose between. And the credential is confirming your ability to choose in those spaces with consistency. So we start with ACC standards, We moved to PCC standards, and we then moved to MCC standards to have a full range of offering with our coaching. Even if we never earn one of those credentials, it's great to be able to pursue those standards with our work. Thank you for listening. And as always, thank you for coaching.